Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the second video that comes right after the introduction to the course, and in this video all I'm hoping to do is to give you a little bit more information and to talk about some of the key terminology and ideas that are covered in your first reading assignment. Your first reading assignment, of course, is in the text, StoCAD text, which, it's the use notes and the introductory chapter to that text, in which it outlines, again, some of the key terms that are implied or used in the class, some of the methods or analytical approaches of art history to the history of art, and really just starts to give you an idea of what art history is all about. On the just a couple notes on these Panopta lectures. You see my talking head over there. You can probably fairly quickly figure out that if you get tired of looking at me talking, if that's not doing anything for you and you want a bigger view of what is on my laptop, the visual information, this will be especially important when we get to the actual lectures that are filled with content. When you want to see the images in greater detail, you can just close down or minimize my little talking head over there and hear me talking in relation to those images. It's totally up to you. So here, hopefully what you see is me, over there on the left, and then what you'll become very familiar with, which is a lecture guide. I don't caption my lectures. In other words, I don't go and put the names of every work of art next to the visual images. I don't want that to get in the way of you looking at those visual images. So instead of doing that, what I do is I type up as Word documents these lecture guides, and they will contain in particular all of the works of art, or their titles, the approximate dates on those works of art, and you should be aware of this. There are some terms that if you've never taken history or haven't taken much of it, be aware of this. The letter C in front of a date means circa. That means it's somewhere around that date, and particularly with the oldest works of art, we don't know exactly when they were produced, so you'll see a lot of C's in this course that says it's around 25,000 BC or whatever. And then after that, you'll see the letters BCE, which means before the Common Era. That means before, zero. Going backward in time, we used to say before Christ, and then, political correctness and realizing that not everyone's Christian led us to say, hey, let's come up with another term. Or CE, which means Common Era. We live, for instance, in the Common Era, and after we progressed into that period, you'll stop seeing those letters after them. So that will be included. The key terminology employed in the lecture will be included on the lecture guides as well, and that's primarily what you see here in front of you on this lecture guide. As you'll figure out what works best for you, but because the lectures, these video lectures, don't cover every single thing that you'll find in a particular chapter or series of chapters in the text, it might be useful to you to download the lecture guides, have those printed out and on hand, and as you're going through the readings for that week, really focus on the works of art and terms that I am designating in the lecture guides. Now, of course, that's with a mind to saying, if you really want to succeed in this class and you're pinched for time and you want to know what the most important things are that we'll be covering, they're all in the lecture guides. In those chapters, though, there's some pretty great things going on that won't be covered in the lectures, and don't just immediately dismiss those. Look through and read about those other things that may or may not be in the lectures as well. So in this introductory chapter, again, primarily what you'll find are key terms that will be employed in visual or what's known as formal analysis of works of art, the methodologies of art history, some of the terms that you have to be aware of. And just briefly, I want to go over some of these. Now, don't think that you have to know all this after this lecture or after having done the reading. We will be employing all of these terms over and over and over again in specific relation to particular works of art, and that's the place that I find that students really start to understand why we use these terms, what they designate, and why they're important. So this is just kind of an overview before we get started, and I'll try to highlight the terms that are going to be most important for us. So first off, at the top of the lecture guide, and as I said before, it would be a good idea if you haven't already to pause this and print that lecture guide out so that you can have it handy and jot down notes on it, or have it open in another window in your on your computer so that you can add your own notes. I make them Word documents so that you can type in your own notes with these if you want to do it that way. Let's just go over this. So, number one of the things that we want to get a handle on to gain what's called visual literacy, right? Understanding the way that visual languages communicate their messages or what their significance is that in the realm of art history, we focus on each one of these little pieces of information or little things employed by artists and ask what they're doing or what their meaning might be in isolation, and then we add them all together to come up with what we think the artist was trying to communicate or what that culture was trying to communicate or how those things signified or meant what they did within the particular culture in which they were employed. So, or another way to put this is just visual languages are a language, and you need to understand, or we all want to understand, how these operate. This is one of those places that in the larger scheme of things, knowing something about how visual languages work, and employing them in relation to ancient works of art is one thing, but you can also take all of these ideas and think about them in relation to your own incredibly visually saturated world to think about how visual information flows through your life and how it is communicating to you and seducing you and angering you and trying to sway you one way or another. So it is something that, is useful well beyond the realm of art history. We call the individual elements of a work of art, such as line and shape and color and space and light and all of these things, the formal or visual elements of art. And when we try to analyze these formal or visual elements of art to attain some sense of what their meaning is, we call that formal or visual analysis. So one of the big kind of starting points for art is line, right? Almost all at least two-dimensional works of art and most three-dimensional works of art have line in them. The types of line that will show up most often in this class are what is known as contour line. That's a line that bounds an object, right? The line that goes around an object that gives us some sense of its three-dimensionality. But there's also a type of line that a lot of works of art use to move us around, let's say a painting or a picture, or even sculptures do this as well, known as implied line. These aren't actual lines. These are lines that are established when someone points towards something, right? And you follow the pointing gesture towards something else off into the distance. So it's a kind of implied line that might be in a work of art. Lines can have different qualities or effects is a term that's probably more familiar to you. Like, for instance, if you have a really sharp, jagged line on something, it's likely to agitate us more than a long, smooth, sinewy line or a continuous line. And again, we'll pick up these things as we go along in the course. Color, it's not a part of every work of art, but knowing what color is and how it affects us is important. There are some terms here that are used in your textbook that I won't use a ton in class. For instance, the term hue literally means the specific color. So red is a hue and blue is a hue. I'll just use the term color. No reason to get fancy there. A tone is a relative lightness or darkness to a color. So the darker it is, the darker its tone. The lighter it is, the lighter its tone, or we call that light tone a tint. The intensity of a color is, as you might imagine, you can have really dull colors and you can have incredibly saturated or intense colors. Warm colors are colors that you might expect are on the warm end of the color spectrum, reds, oranges, yellows, whereas cool colors are things that remind us or seem to be associated with cool things like blues and purples, greens that feel cooler. They all have their own effects that we'll pick up as the color, as the course goes along. Then something that's a little bit confusing to people, we won't use it until later on in the quarter, but colors, if you are in the introductory chapter of the textbook, you'll see that colors are arranged in a color wheel, right? So that when we're using pigments, not digital colors today, so this doesn't refer to VGA colors, for instance, you have three primary colors, usually arranged in a triangle: red, blue, and yellow. And if you combine those colors together, theoretically, you can get every other color. Well, on that color wheel, colors that are next to each other on a color wheel, so for instance, red and orange, are analogous. These are colors that tend to blend together. They tend to harmonize with one another. They tend to give us kind of good feelings. Most of the time when we're wearing clothing, we use, analogous colors. Complementary colors, by contrast, are colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. So if you look at that color wheel in chapter number 1, you'll notice that if you put a red next to a purple, it's going to have one effect, but if you put a red next to its complement, let's say the mixing together of a blue and a yellow, a kind of green, they will actually complement each other in such a way so that each color looks even more bright than it would before. A way to think about this easily is to think like if you watch sports, most athletic teams employ a lot of complementary colors because they're really bright, they stand out a lot, and they tend to be more exciting to us visually. Again, we'll pick these up as we go along with the course. As a matter of fact, most early art doesn't have color, or the color that was on those early works of art has worn off over the ages. Spatial qualities, again, it makes more sense to save some of this till we actually have two-dimensional works of art that are striving to convince us that they look like 3 dimensions, like a painting might, or even some other form of two-dimensional art like a illuminated manuscript page or a mosaic. And these things employ various methods such as overlapping, putting one form in top of the other, or size diminution, which is making things that are further away from us look smaller in order to convince us that they are 3-dimensional. Again, there are a lot of terms here that I put on your handout that are better dealt with as the course goes along when we get to these and we can use examples. There's no reason to really go into the ins and outs of these in detail now. I just wanted to put them here before you on the lecture guide so that you know they're going to be points of interest coming up. The arrangement of everything within a picture or within a sculpture, or even within in architecture, is known as composition, right? So the way that different individual units or figures in a painting or even columns in a architectural form are placed relative to one another, that's known as composition. And again, these things all have different effects on us. Shape, texture, scale, lighting conditions, all things that we'll want to take into account as well. Now on to the more important things initially to have under our belt in terms of terminology. Subject matter takes 2 basic forms that you'll find in your introduction. We've got the natural subject matter of a work of art, meaning something that we can all recognize, so that if you look at a painting and you're able to see it and say, wow, that looks like, it looks like some figures in a landscape. It looks like some people hanging out in the landscape with some trees there, and there's some water there, and there's a building over there. That is its subject matter, right? It's what it is a representation of that we can recognize with just a very little information. If we've seen that thing before, we can recognize it in a work of art. The iconography of a work of art, or its non-natural subject matter, might be, for instance, that those figures actually are referring to a form of belief. Let's say you look at those figures and in your introductory chapter you have a crucifixion scene by Roger van der Weyden that's gone into in great depth. On the first glance, you're like, these are figures next to someone who's, on a cross, and there's landscape in the background. If you don't know what Christianity is, you don't know the next level of the subject matter, or its iconography. Iconography literally means picture writing. If you do know that that is the crucifixion, that's another form of subject matter. It's referring to the biblical text and the belief systems about what a crucifixion of Jesus Christ means for Christians, and you can start asking different questions of the work of art. Now, all of this is slightly different than the content or the meaning of the work of art. We think of the content or the meaning of the work of art as a combination of the formal or visual elements of art with its subject matter, with its symbolism or iconography, and in relation to the context of the time, what's going on in the time, and how that has an effect on why an artist picked a particular subject matter in the first place, decided to represent it in a particular way in another case, and so forth. Another big term that you'll need to wrap your mind around, it's a simple one, the medium, or media is the plural of this. The medium simply means what a work of art is made out of, what its material is. So you can think in terms of paintings. Is it a fresco painting? Is it a tempera painting? Is it an oil painting? Is it an encaustic painting? And all those different types of painting have their strengths and their limitations. Sometimes they're very symbolic, like someone might pick a particular type of material because it's got a certain symbolism associated with it. So for instance, outside of painting, we know that in Egypt, sculptures were oftentimes made out of granite or basalt, which is incredibly hard, right? I can't even imagine how these people carved those forms. But they did it because the Egyptians believed in permanence, and they wanted a medium that would last forever. Or, for instance, gold. Why would an artist use gold? Well, gold is highly symbolic, right? It captures the sun, which is one of the earliest kind of deified forms, a god of the sun, or it lasts forever, or whatever it might be. So the medium can be incredibly important on a number of different levels. On the simple level, we want to say, well, maybe they used marble because they had marble everywhere, and it didn't really mean much. Or on the other hand, maybe they used basalt because they didn't really have a whole lot of basalt, but they wanted their sculpture to last forever. Or maybe they started with bronze, but they covered it with gold, and what did the gold actually mean there, right? Symbolism or iconography, these are oftentimes used as synonymous terms. That's, we all know what a symbol is. In my day, the easiest symbol to point to was something like, Mr. Yuck, or the peace sign symbol. Symbols don't have meanings in and of themselves, right? Unless someone's told you that the little frowny face guy with his eyes crossed out actually means poison, you're not going to know it means poison. Or unless someone tells you that strange kind of form that looks a little bit like a Mercedes emblem is actually the peace sign, you're not going to know it means that until you figure out the context of the work, until you figure out the convention that made a connection between these different forms. So symbolism is pretty cool. There's a lot of symbolism in earlier art forms, the use of skulls, for instance, to relate to death, or the use of a crucifix form to refer to the whole story of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for Christians. And once you know them, they tend to show up over and over again in art, and you can apply them over and over again. One of the trickiest terms in art history, and it derives from the belief that in a particular time period, there are beliefs, right? And these works of art are, in a way, visual representations of those beliefs. Style means that, especially a period style, which is primarily what we're talking about here, is that, the Egyptians, for instance, create figures, and I'm sure you all know this, that don't look like real figures, right? They have like their head turned one way and their shoulders turned another way and their body turned another way. No one would ever take that pose in everyday life, would they? Probably not. So the question is why they did that. And we can say that within a particular culture, during a particular time span, artists tend to represent their subject matter in very standard ways. And those standard ways of representing them, we call it style. It's a shorthand way of saying, hey, the Egyptian style, they represent things this way. And then we can go on to say why, or ask the question of why did they represent it this way? How does that confirm their belief system? How does it communicate a message according to what that belief system was in their own time period? So again, to recap this, a period style is a generalizable group of characteristics of particular works of art created by a particular culture within a particular time span. An example, we have Egyptian, we have classical Greece, we have Hellenistic Greece, we have Roman works of art that have their own particular look. If you think about the history of painting, some of you know it's like you've got the Renaissance, you've got the Baroque period, you've got Impressionism. These are all period styles. Less important for ancient art, you've got representational styles. And what this means is, instead of just thinking about within a particular period, we can say that this type of style is very realistic. This type of style is very illusionistic. This type of style is meant to create an ideal. And as we go along in this quarter, we'll be talking about those different representational styles. As I mentioned in the first video, one of the most important things for this class, which is about ancient art, is its context. We want to know as much as we can about the world and the culture in which these works of art were produced and in which they were consumed, right? In which they functioned. So the belief systems of a time period, the fact that a war might have occurred, that a leader might have been deposed, the particular religions within these, the philosophical traditions, these are oftentimes reflected in the visual works of art of that time period. After all, the artists are working for a particular clientele that has the same belief systems. They are meant to communicate within those sets of belief systems. And I mean belief systems very broadly, like the belief that the world is flat might show up in a work of art in particular ways. And so the more we know about the context, and by the way, the works of art can tell us a lot about the context, the more we can learn about the work of art and how both its form and its meaning functioned within that context. Over again in this class, you're going to be reading a lot about not just the works of art, but what the people of the time believed. And that's important, making the connection between how a work of art looks and what it means, right, has to employ the context. You have to know what was going on. In that introductory chapter as well, you'll see a little brief kind of schematic about art historical methodology. Methodology is a kind of fancy term to say, how do you go about, interpreting the meaning of the work, or how it functioned, or what its communicative message might have been. And the introductory chapter basically breaks this into 4 different parts. Now, these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and as a matter of fact, they all go together if we can make them go together. If we do our art historical analysis properly. So here, under general art historical methodology, the text points out that the very first kind of starting point is assessing the physical properties of a work of art. This doesn't take much in terms of art history. It's the most objective starting point for thinking about works of art. So we're assessing, for instance, the physical properties such as its shape, its size, its materials, and the techniques that went into producing that work of art. It's just really standard stuff. So you might say, for instance, that shape of that ancient sculpture looks exactly like the stone it would have been carved from, because the techniques available to them to carve stone when they didn't have iron tools was such that it had to take that form. Or the size of a work of art being really small was probably something that was meant to be handheld rather than a giant work of art that obviously was immobile and had to be here or there. Or as I said before, the materials can be very symbolic. Number 2, analyzing the formal structure or making assertions about the effects of the formal or visual elements employed by works of art. Again, this is something that all those terms such as line and shape and color and texture will be employed to help analyze works of art. Here, before we get into the works themselves, there's no reason to be very abstract and talk about this, but just think of it this way. Each one of those different formal elements. If an artist chooses red, why did they choose red, right? If they make the surface of a work of art really textured rather than smooth, why would they have done that? And then figuring out what the answer to that might be, and making assertions about what the effects of these formal elements are, is one of the building blocks of art history. So that we can say that, for instance, a Renaissance work that's all about beauty is meant to inspire a particular emotion in the viewer, whereas an expressionist work of art that's supposed to freak you the heck out is supposed to do something else entirely. And then we look at which formal elements are being employed to do that. Identifying the subject matter of a work of art. The subject matter of a work of art, as we said before, takes two forms: the natural subject matter, which is the recognizable form and situation in a work of art, such as people in a landscape with trees and water, etc. And the iconography or symbolism, or the second order of the subject matter, is how that natural subject matter might be representative of something more, such as figures in the landscape might be telling us a story from the Bible, or a story from an Islamic text, or a story from ancient, Greek mythology, or what have you. So think of those in combination. And finally, as I mentioned before, thinking about all of these in relation to the work's cultural and historical context, right? Why did the artist choose this subject matter at this time? Why was it so important? What was this work supposed to do? How did it function within this time period? If we know that, what can we say about that? And even more importantly, and a big question for art historians, is why did the artist represent the subject in this particular way rather than another particular way? An example I often give of this, and I don't mean to offend anyone by this, but think of it this way. Just take a minute and think about your favorite song right now, right? Whatever your jam is, it's like this artist, this song is my favorite song. I love this song. And get it in your head, like actually hear that music in your head. If you got that in your head now, let's pick your least favorite musician. For me, and I again don't mean to offend anyone, if he's your favorite artist, go for it, but Justin Bieber just remade your favorite song, right? He remade your favorite song. It's got all the same words, it's got all the same kind of musical tones, but it's got a different timbre to the voice, it's got a little bit different feel to it. Is it really the same song? You're going to be seeing a lot of works of art that are on the same subject, right? It might be the representation of a major leader, but the artists, because they're a product of a particular society that has its own belief systems, will represent that subject quite a bit differently. And looking at works of art and understanding why those differences are in the works of art is a big component of art history. Why did this artist represent it this way rather than another way? And here's an example of that, just very briefly at the end of this introductory lecture. I'm going to pull up on the screen a slide of two works of art, one that you'll see in the second week. On the left here in front of you is a work that is a small figurine. You wouldn't know that by looking at these, by the way, on the screen. That's something to keep in mind. Because we look at all these things on the screen now, it tends to make the scale of them all exactly the same, right? But this is a small little figurine, known a little bit improperly as the Venus of Willendorf. They titled it the Venus way back in the 17th or 18th century. But it's not a Venus. Venus is the name of the Roman name for the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And actually you see a Greek work of art of Aphrodite on the right-hand side. This is a work of art, it's actually a copy after a Greek original that has been lost by the artist sculptor Praxiteles during the kind of late classical period known as the Aphrodite of Cnidus. Now on the surface, again, with the misnomer of the title on the left, they would both seem to be on the same subject. They're both at the basic level of subject matter. They're both a woman, right? On another level, though, of subject matter, on the right, because we know a lot about Greek mythology, or what for them was their religion, of course, we know that that is a very particular goddess with her own particular attributes, her own strengths, her own stories. We know a lot about her. And so on the second order, or the iconographical iconographical level of meaning with the Aphrodite of Cnidus, we can connect that form to all these stories that we know about Aphrodite. We have less of that information about this prehistorical figure that was created, somewhere between 28,000 and 25,000 BCE, because we don't, they didn't keep historical records. They don't have written mythology or religious practices. So again, we just saw a female form that emphasized the body and titled it the Venus. But here's the curious thing about this. Aphrodite in Greek times had many of the same attributes we think are meant to be emphasized by the Venus of Willendorf figure here over on the left. The Aphrodite figure, Aphrodite as a goddess, was a goddess of beauty and of, in particular for the Greeks, sexuality. In particular, even more so, in the production of children, in the seduction of men, in terms of sex, right? And it's we'll get to it in due course, what Aphrodite meant, but, that's what she was about. This figure over here on the left, the Aphrodite, or the Venus figure from Willendorf, which is, by the way, near modern-day Austria, is likely to be a little figurine. She's carved out of limestone, and she was covered in a red ochre. Red ochre was probably associated with fertility and fecundity, which is a fancy word. It's like fertility, but fecundity means kind of the plentifulness of all nature, the ensuring that the crops would grow and that you wouldn't have droughts and that children would be born, that you'd have enough food and so forth. This figure probably represents these same ideas because we know these early hunter-gatherer societies really wanted to ensure those things. And so they created what are oftentimes called animistic figures or little charms, or what oftentimes are called fertility figurines, such as this, that were meant to ensure, let's say, the birth of healthy children during an age we know, for instance, that child mortality rates were upwards of 40%, to ensure that you'd have enough food. And the form of this figure is keyed to that. I mean, think about this for a minute. Look at her. She doesn't have a face, so we can say right off, well, it's not about an individual person, right? It doesn't seem to be emphasizing that. But what is being emphasized? Breasts, a belly button here, or navel, the pubic triangle, her vulva form, a really fleshy form. And if you look at her back, she's very fleshy too. She seems to be putting her hands over her breasts to emphasize this. Breasts were, of course, a life-giving force producing from the human's own body, nourishment for children. All of the things that are associated on the one hand with the context, we know that they cared about these things, are found in the visual form that emphasizes things that we take to be a component of fertility and fecundity in the world. That form, though, looks quite a bit different than the Aphrodite of Cnidus, doesn't it? I mean, why doesn't she have gigantic breasts, and why doesn't she have a really fleshy form? Why is she covering up her genitalia? Again, because it comes from a different culture with different belief systems, different norms around sexuality, different uses or functions for this sculpture, different traditions that led to the production of what is an idealized form of woman. But we'll get to that in due course. So hopefully this gives you some sense of, at least a starting point for what art history is all about. Again, in this first week, what I'm asking you to do is read through the introductory chapters of the textbook. Take some good notes on what those terms mean, what the art historical approaches to analyzing works of art are, or its methodologies. Ask any questions that you have, although, some of these terms are going to turn up later in the quarter, so don't worry about that so much immediately. And then you've got two assignments, both of which are discussion posts. First, I'd like you to post a bio, and the specific prompt is on Canvas under that discussion post or discussion forum. And then second, I'd like you to post in no more than 500 words. That might be far too much, frankly, but it gives you at least a ballpark figure. I don't want you to just put in one or two sentences. What you think art is. What are some of its characteristics? What makes art different than other things that we don't call art? In addition to that, second discussion forum, I would like you to And again, I don't care what this art form is. Tell the rest of the class what one of your favorite works of art is and why. And you don't have to go into great details, but say something so that someone has something to respond to. Like, I love Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and this is why. This is what it makes me feel like. This is why it's important to me. Then after you've made your post, you'll be able to see other people's posts, and I'd like you to respond to someone else's post in whatever manner you want, briefly, before the end of the day Friday. As with all discussion posts, except for this week, the bio I'd like up for no later than Tuesday night. But with every other discussion post over the course of the quarter, post your initial post by Wednesday midnight and respond to someone else's post when that has been required no later than midnight on Friday night. Again, if you have any questions that might benefit the rest of the class hearing an answer to, post those in the frequently asked questions discussion forum. All right, we're off to I hope this is a nice, even-paced starting point for us. We're all just getting our feet under us, and next week, the module number 2 will open on Monday, early in the morning, no later than, let's say, 10 a.m. And you'll be able to delve into prehistoric art, where we'll be looking at things like the Venus of Willendorf here in greater detail, along with a couple of other fertility figurines. We'll be looking at the cave paintings all through Spain and France in particular, and what those might have meant and been used for in prehistoric times. And then one of the major icons of the prehistoric period, we'll be looking at Stonehenge, and you've got a specific topical reading on a new interpretation of what Stonehenge may or may not have been all about. And by the way, I'll give you a little hint in advance. There are some pretty wild readings of what Stonehenge was all about, and some pretty standard ones by now, but we don't know for sure what that was used for, and it probably changed over the course of almost 800 years that it was in use in this Druid culture on what is contemporary England landscape. Great. Again, looking forward to a quarter with you, and I will see you either through the discussion posts. I will be weighing in on those, or next week on Monday in the first content-based lecture for the course. Thanks.